My name is David Douglas. I want to welcome you today to the Douglas Family History YouTube channel. If you would do me a favor and subscribe to our YouTube channel, this would help us out. And also, if you would give us a thumbs up and make a comment. Today we want to begin and start this video with my fifth great-grandfather named Robert Douglas Sr. And today, as we continue on this journey, we're going to be talking about the Douglas family in Georgia. Robert Douglas Sr. was born approximately in 732 in Brunswick County, Virginia. His father's name was Robert Douglas, and his mother's first name was Mary. The last name is unknown at this time. He married Olive Reeves, daughter of William Reeves and Margaret Burgess. Robert Douglas Sr. and Olive had these children: Edward, born 1750, Thomas, born 1753, Robert Jr., born 1755, and this is my fourth great-grandfather. Then Angelina, whom was known as Laney, born 1758, and Rachel, born 1760. All these children was born in Halifax County, North Carolina, and we'll be talking about that in our next video about the Douglases in North Carolina. Robert Douglas Sr. was selling his land in Halifax County, North Carolina in 1765. I believe getting ready to move to Georgia. I believe he came that year to check out the land before moving. There is a record dated April the 13th, 1765, where Robert Douglas signed a land record with Henry Caldwell in the St. Andrews Parish along the Altamaha River is where this land was located. His brother James Douglas applied for land in 1768 in a place called St. George Parish, which is present-day Burke County, Georgia. That did not work out for James, so land opened up in 1770 in the St. Andrews Parish along the Altamaha River. So I believe that sort of places that Robert Douglas as the one in my family tree. So I believe sometimes after 1765, Robert Douglas, as we know as Robert Douglas Sr., moved to Georgia with his family. And it looks like his son Edward Douglas stayed in North Carolina just a little bit longer. In 1770, Robert Douglas Sr. applied for a land grant. Then on August the 6th, 1772, Robert Douglas Sr. received that land grant of 100 acres. That land was located in St. George Parish in Burke County, which is present-day Burke County. That land was located by a man whose last name was Sharp. About that time, the Revolutionary War broke out, and there was a lot of unrest in the Georgia colony. Robert Douglas Sr. and his son Robert Douglas Jr. signed a Tory petition on August the 10th, 1774. Also on that list were other men of the St. George Parish, and there was a man named Charles Golightly. This man was listed in the will of Robert Douglas Sr.'s grandfather, William Douglas Sr., in 1764 in Halifax County, North Carolina. This petition was a protest that all these men were in favor of not breaking away from England, but soon after that, the majority of these signers changed their mind. Robert Sr., Robert Jr., and Charles Golightly was among the ones that changed their mind. I cannot find no record at this time that tells me, if Robert Sr. and Robert Jr. fought in the Revolutionary War. They might have fought in the militia. A lot of the militia records were lost and they're scarce, and I just cannot find, no proof of them fighting in the Revolutionary War. But at some point, Robert Sr. migrated, and this was after the Revolutionary War, but that young man named Charles Golightly, he ended up fighting in the Revolutionary War in a man's unit called John Robert's militia. Now, John Robert also owned land next to Robert Sr., so these families were sort of intermingled. But like I said, at some point after the Civil War, he migrated into Washington County, Georgia. Now, they began to form counties now. And then that part of Washington County, Georgia, became Montgomery County, Georgia. Robert Douglas Sr. appeared on the 1797-1798 Montgomery County, Georgia tax rolls with his sons Edward and Robert Jr. Robert Douglas Sr. also served on the grand jury in Montgomery County, Georgia. Robert Douglas Sr., along with his sons Edward and Robert Jr., participated in the 1805 Georgia Land Lottery in Montgomery County, Georgia. Robert Douglas Sr. would sometimes, I reckon pretty soon, die approximately 1805 in Montgomery County, Georgia. And because the records of him, it's sort of like a lot of the records were sort of scarce after that, so in the census records did not show him up, so he died somewhere around 1805 in Montgomery County, Georgia. And it is said by some of the Douglas family researchers that does family history that he is buried in the old Reiner Cemetery that is in present-day Johnson County, not too far from Meeks, Georgia. This land at one time was called the Old Douglas Land, probably owned by Robert Douglas Sr., because Washington County, it stretched a long way, and then it formed into Montgomery County, and then later on Johnson County. And it was probably, like I said, owned by Robert Douglas Sr. And so his son, Robert Douglas Jr., who is my fourth great-grandfather, as I mentioned, Robert Douglas Jr. did receive a headright grant in Washington County in 1785 for 200 acres. Now, that was not a Revolutionary war soldier's grant. That was just a headright grant. So he possibly did not fight in the Revolutionary War. He possibly sort of, might have helped out, providing, cattle, different thing, but we just don't know. So, but Robert Douglas Jr. married Margaret, who I believe was a Johnson. They had 3 children that we know of, and their names was Robert Duncan Douglas, who was born 1790, Seaburn Douglas, who was my third great-grandfather, born 1800, and Rebecca E. Douglas, born 1807. Now, I believe Robert Duncan Douglas and Seaburn Douglas was born in Montgomery County. And Rebecca, I believe, was born in Lawrence County, Georgia. There might have been other children prior to 1790, but they have not been located as of yet. Robert Douglas Jr. would serve on the grand jury in Montgomery County, Georgia in 1798. He did fight in the military. He also served in the Montgomery County Militia around 1803. There's a record where he received a field commission of a lieutenant. And this document said that he had attained a gentleman status. That was on as a title on his name. In 1803, he witnessed a land transaction with David Mims in the Montgomery County, Georgia. He sold land to his brother Edward, which is located near the Ohoopee River, in 1803, prior to moving to Lawrence County, Georgia. The last document that we have that he witnessed was an affidavit in 1807 in Wilkerson County, Georgia, with Samuel Bozeman and Andrew Grant. And I believe at this time, William Cothran was actually the Justice of the Peace, which was making out this document, and he also signed it as Justice of the Peace. Robert Douglas Jr. died approximately April 1808 in Lawrence County, Georgia. Then the Lawrence County, Georgia court issued the administration of his estate on April 11th, 1808. This appraisal was valued at $506.75 on July the 22nd, 1808. His brother Edward Douglas became a legal guardian of his two sons, Robert Duncan Douglas and Seaburn Douglas. Like I said earlier, Seaburn Douglas is my third great-grandfather. You can find him on the 1820 Emanuel County, Georgia census as you see Seaburn next to and not really far from Edward Douglas, who was his legal guardian, actually his uncle, and also next to Burl Yates, who I'll talk about a little bit later on. Seaburn would later on move to Appleton County, Georgia, where his brother Robert Duncan Douglas and his mother Margaret was living. He first appears there on a tax list digest, a solvent list, I think they called it, dated 1822, along with Burl Yates. His name is right there by Burl Yates, as he was being checked in on the tax and solvent list. He stays real close with this man for a long time. Also, Burl Yates and Nathan Smith witnesses a land deed transaction between Seaburn Douglas and Cornelius English on November 11th, 1826. There is some connection between Seaburn Douglas and Burl Yates. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This land that was witnessed by Burl Yates and Nathan Smith was land lot 20 in the 2nd District of Appleton County, which is present-day Bacon County. This land is also joining and next to Burl Yates' land. This land, like I said, is in present-day Bacon County, Georgia, where the Campground Methodist Church and Cemetery is located. His brother Robert Duncan Douglas and his wife Sarah is said to be buried in that cemetery. Seaburn would then after move to Hamilton County, Florida, where we find him on the 1830 Hamilton County, Florida census along with Burl Yates and his son William Yates. Now, Seaburn, I believe, married Burl Yates' daughter. We do not know her first name. And at one point we find Seaburn on the 1840 Lowndes County census, and it shows that he has a daughter. Now, his wife is not mentioned on this census, so I believe that she had passed away. So there's a daughter there, and her name is unknown to me, born approximately 1821. And then they had a son named Burl Douglas, born 1825, and I had found out this later. He meant who these children's name was, except for two daughters. Then they had a son, Seaburn, and the Yates young lady had a son named William Riley, born 1828. Then a son named Robert Douglas, born 1831. then a son named Albert B. Douglas, born 1835, then a daughter named Roseanne Douglas, born 1839. Albert B. Douglas was born 1833. I might have made a mistake on his age right before Roseanne, but Albert was born 1833 and Roseanne was born 1839. Then they had a daughter who was unnamed, and I don't know her name at this time, born 1840. Seaborn Douglas would serve in the Florida Indian War from June the 5th, 1837 to January the 6th, 1840. Now, where they were living at in Lowndes County, like I said earlier than that, they were moving back into from Lowndes County into Hamilton County, and I believe it was because of the Indian War outbreak. But he was served in these units and under these men, these captains, Captain A. McCrae, Captain Peter W. Law, and Captain Allen G. Johnson. He shows up next, like I said, they were backing two from Florida into Georgia. But he would show up next on the Lowndes County 1838 Digest as a tax defaulter, probably because of fighting in the Florida Seminole Indian War. He then shows up on the 1840 Lowndes County Tax Digest again as a tax defaulter. But he's in the Captain Johnson district. And I believe when he moves into Georgia and stays for a while, he ends up fighting with and under Captain Johnson in Georgia. And that's where he musters out in 1840 from the Indian War. And I believe probably that's when the Indian War probably, ended. Then on the 1840 Lowndes County, Georgia census, there we find him with all his children. But there's no wife listed. There's no age for his wife listed on the 1840 Lowndes County census. But there is a 70-year-old female, and we will talk about her later, that is in his household. Looks like Seaborn died at an early age, sometime between 1840 and 1850, because we cannot find him on the 1850 census. Sometimes after the death of Seaborn Douglas, 3 of his sons, we find them living in Hamilton County, Florida on the 1850 census. Now we're going to go into Florida a little bit again, and then, like I said, back into Georgia. And they are Burl Douglas, who is my second great-grandfather, with his wife Mary, and their 2 children, James and Nancy. And Robert Douglas is another one of Seaborn's sons that is there, and he's in the household as a worker. Then there's William R. Douglas with his wife Nancy, who was a Cox. He married a Nancy Cox. And there with one child at this time named Louisa, and there's a female named Winnie Cothran at the age of 80 years old. I believe that this Winnie Cothran was the 70-year-old female in the household of Seaborn Douglas on the 1840 Lowndes County census. The Cothrans and the Yates were connected, and they were also connected, I believe, with the Douglases. I do not have a record to prove it, but like I said, I believe that Seaborn Douglas probably marries one of Burl Yates' daughters, because my second great-grandfather, Burl Douglas, he looks like he receives, as far as his name, sort of namesake from his grandfather on his mother's side. So then sometimes between 1851 and 1853, Burl Douglas, who is my second great-grandfather, and his family would move back to Wayne County. That is where Burl's wife's mother and father was living at that time, who was James Strickland and a lady, Lavina, whose maiden name was Harper. Burrell Douglas is seen receiving a land grant of 490 acres in 1853. He appears on several land grants and court records in Wayne County, Georgia, until the Civil War breaks out. We also find him as a legal guardian to James A. Strickland Sr.'s son, whose name was William Strickland. So I believe, like I said, that Burrell Douglas married Mary Ann Strickland. You can find on the death certificate of Nancy Isabella, his daughter, who had married at that time, right before she died, had married and living there in Sylvester, and her last name was Eunice at that time, but on the death certificate, it has her mother as Mary Strickland. So I believe her father was James A. Strickland, and her mother was Lavina Strickland. They're on the 1840 Lowndes County census, not too far from Seaburn Douglas, and I believe that's where Burrell Douglas and Nancy Strickland, I believe, are married. So, here they are in Ware County, and Burrell Douglas appears on the 1860 Wayne County census, and I believe in Wayne County they have their next children, which is Henry, Martha Jane, Seaburn, and Mary Ann, and Burrell Jr. So when the Civil War breaks out, he enlists under Captain T.S. Hopkins. And I found out not long back, I live in Thomas County, not too far from Thomasville, Georgia. And this is where Captain T.S. Hopkins is from, Thomas County. And he's buried there in the city of Thomasville, in that cemetery. And I believe that he was a doctor either before the Civil War or somewhere after the Civil War. He became a doctor. So Burrell enlisted under Captain T.S. Hopkins at a place called Camp Fort, which was located at that time in Waynesville, Georgia, on September the 9th. Now, Waynesville is in Brantley County, but at that time it was Wayne County, because Wayne County stretched from where it's at now all the way to the Florida line. But he enlisted on September the 9th, 1862, and the name of the battalion was the 24th Battalion, Georgia Cavalry, and he was in Company G. And my grandmother, her grandfather, on her mother's side, Washington Jackson Griffin, was in the same unit. They served together. So these families stayed close, the way it looked. Then at Camp Lee in Bryan County, Georgia, Burrell Douglas Sr., he deserted. There was a lot of dissension according to the records and books that were wrote about. At this time, it was the 7th Georgia Cavalry, the 24th Battalion, all their units that they merged. I believe it was the 21st Battalion, and then I think there was another unit, and these three units merged and made up the 7th Georgia Cavalry. But there was a lot of dissension with the soldiers over a matter between Captain T.S. Hopkins and Colonel Edward C. Anderson. There was a lot of men deserting. But I believe also that Burrell deserted because his wife, at this point, the amount of time that he was gone, had a little girl named Mary Ann who was born in January. And I believe he just wanted to see her, but he was not able to get a leave of absence. So he went, I reckon, absent without leave. He went AWOL. So, when Burrell returned to Wayne County, he enlisted with Captain Mann, who at that time had a group called the Satilla Rifles. And when his name hit the War Department, he was arrested and put on trial for desertion in Savannah, Georgia. The trial took place over a store called the Cleghorn and Cunningham store by the Savannah River. All this was located, and I found this record in Edward C. Anderson's papers. So the store was located by the Savannah River, and the trial took place over that store. And I believe the last time I was in Savannah, Georgia, I believe that maybe, I don't know how far, but there is a hotel or an inn called River Street Inn, and you could see a staircase, a stairway right there at the end of that building walking up. So the trial took place, according to Edward C. Anderson at that time, who was their colonel, took place over the Cleghorn and Cunningham store. That building is still located there, actually right next to the Cotton Exchange building, which was possibly built later, sometimes after the Civil War. So he was found guilty of desertion, court-martialed, April 11th, 1864, and was sentenced to be executed by firing squad. The execution was suspended by Major General Samuel Cooper. But yet he remained in custody in the Oglethorpe Barracks in Savannah, Georgia. Right before Sherman reached Savannah, Georgia, during his march towards the sea, the president of the Southern Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, pardoned him and 23 other men. And the record that I got from Washington, D.C. archives said that he was restored, him and these 23 other men was restored back to duty, and they were pardoned on November the 19th, 1864, right before Sherman reached Savannah. So they needed more men to fight. So Burl, I believe, remained part of that war, and he possibly fought as what we call an irregular. A lot of the records in Savannah, and even after that, was lost. So then, the war ended, I believe April, of 1865, a little bit later on, the war would end. I say 1865, somewhere 1864, 1865. Then after that war, Burl would move his family and settle in the Okefenokee Swamp. And we had talked about that earlier in our previous video about the Douglases and the Okefenokee Swamp. So if you're interested in Douglas family history, especially in my line, if you're connected with it or you see where you're connected, continue to follow with us on the Douglas Family History YouTube channel. And please, if you would, please subscribe, and share this and, get word out, because I'm here as far as to preserve my family history. So, till next time, like I said, we're going to be talking about in our next video about the Douglas family in North Carolina.